Hello, good morning, Year 10. I thought that this would be a good time for us to do some revision, go back and see what we can remember about one of the systems that we need to learn about, which is the cardiovascular system. So in this lesson today, there's going to be a series of little short videos followed by some questions for you to attempt so you can try and apply that knowledge. But as I said, this is a revision lesson, so I won't go into much detail here, but I will recap on some of the fundamentals to do with the cardiovascular system. So before I do crack on, just want to remind you, with the cardiovascular system, anytime we hear the word cardio, we are thinking it's to do with the heart. So the cardiovascular system. Also, similarly, if you hear the word vascular, as you can see here, we are talking about all those vessels that are connected with this process. So the cardio, meaning heart, and vascular system, meaning the vessels that obviously the blood flows through. So that's the first thing to think about there when we look at this system. Now, we definitely have some key terms that we need to know, we need to be comfortable with, and we need to understand. So what is the cardiovascular system? Better question, what makes up the cardiovascular system? Well, we got three different things here. We have, of course, the heart, as we talked about, the cardio element of that word, the heart, which is a muscle, and we can't forget that. It's a particular type of muscle called cardiac muscle. We have, of course, the blood vessels. So these are the arteries, the capillaries, the veins that help to make up that whole system, which we'll delve into in a bit more detail later on. And of course, central to this is also the blood that flows through this system, flows into the heart, around through the blood vessels and being delivered to all the muscles and the cells of the body, and the various different things that they carry as well. So we'll look at that in a bit more detail too. So we have to obviously know about the different types of blood vessels, and we'll just touch on them here, but we know that we need to look at them in a little bit more detail later on in the lesson. So the heart pumps the blood, it's transported around the body in three main blood vessels, and they are, of course, the arteries, which transport the blood away from the heart. Now you'll notice here that I put this underlined letter, it's an A, and that is to help us remember that arteries transport blood away from the heart. And if you can just lock that into your head, you'll find that easy to remember that, and you won't forget it. And then, of course, number two, we have veins. Veins transport blood back to the heart, and we have capillaries. Now, these capillaries are a little bit different than the arteries and veins in that they're only one cell thick, very, very microscopic, very, very small. Why are they so small? Well, within the capillaries, this is where the oxygen needs to pass through, enter the muscle, and the carbon dioxide also needs to pass through the walls of the capillaries to be taken back to the lungs so we can expel that carbon dioxide, because we don't want that in our body. So they're the three main blood vessels to do with the cardiovascular system. But this particular section is about functions of the cardiovascular system, and there's three main functions that we need to know when we talk about the cardiovascular system. And of course, really, really important is transport. All the substances in the blood need to be transported around the body. That is so they can be delivered to the muscles if we're talking about oxygen, obviously glucose, carbon dioxide, and lactic acid. So transport isn't just about delivery of these nutrients. For some of these nutrients, such as carbon dioxide and lactic acid, we're talking about removal of these nutrients. Second, we've got controlling body temperature. Now, with body temperature, it's important to know that the blood vessels run all over our body, even close to the skin. Now, when we feel cold, chemical signals are delivered to these vessels that can widen and also that can narrow process that we call vasoconstriction and vasodilation, dilation being when the blood vessels widen. So it's important that the body can send these chemicals to do this process that can encourage blood closer to the skin or away from the skin, depending on what temperature we are. Again, we'll get into that in a little bit more detail. The final function of the cardiovascular system is clotting. Now, this is very, very important, and particularly when we think about athletes, and lots of sports that we take part in, that we watch, involve a high degree of impact, and there's always an element of danger associated with taking part in any sort of sport. So if you think of a rugby player, for example, that is getting high impacts from the opposing team, if they were to clash heads and, let's say, cut their head, the clotting process to do with this system kicks in and it stops them, hopefully, from bleeding too much. So that we're going to definitely focus on clotting element again when we look at the different components of the blood in particular, and the role the platelets play in that. Now, also we have to know that blood contains cells and antibodies that fight infection and stop bleeding. Again, we'll get into this in a little bit more detail later in the lesson, where we can have a little look at that. But for now, we just need to know these three functions of the cardiovascular system. Write them down, try to remember them, try to be able to recall them very, very easily and quickly. So transport, control body temperature, and clotting. So let's look here at temperature regulation. So vasodilation. So vaso, if you hear the word vaso, you just think, well, what else does that sound like? Well, it sounds like vessels. So we're talking about the vessels here, and the dilation means to widen. To dilate, I should say, means to widen. So if the body gets too hot, the blood vessels close to the skin get bigger or dilate. So just think on a warm summer's day, what's happening, or if you're exercising, you're getting very, very hot, this is what's happening. Those blood vessels are widening. This encourages more blood to go to the skin so we can get rid of that heat, so that heat can be radiated out of our body. And the second one we've got is vasoconstriction. Now, as I said, we hear the word vaso, we think vessels, so we know what we're talking about. And to constrict something means to narrow it down, to close it, to try and close it. Now, if the body gets too cold, the blood vessels close to the skin get smaller or constrict. And so what does this do? It allows blood to be diverted away from the skin, so maybe pulled towards the internal organs. This allows less heat to be lost, so we can remain at a normal temperature for our body. So that's very, very important process, the second function of the cardiovascular system. And the last one, clotting. We have within our blood things called platelets. We'll look at a picture of platelets later on. Now these platelets, if a cut or some sort of injury occurs, these platelets will seal the open wounds quickly, so they coagulate. That's a fancy term for to clot. They coagulate, they seal an open wound as quickly as possible. And this is important in guarding the body against infection and excessive bleeding. We don't want excessive bleeding. Obviously, we want to keep our blood inside our body because it's so important. But also, any open wound, it opens up the chance of an infection coming into the body, and we don't want that as well. So really, really vital that these platelets are clotting that blood as quickly as possible, depending on the seriousness of the wound that is inflicted. And of course, we have to always apply this, as I did earlier, to a rugby player. You could mention a boxer, but there is always a risk of being cut, particularly in sports such as boxing, football, UFC, many of you watch. So these platelets and this process of clotting is very, very important to overcome these risks of injuries or infections.